Welcome to the Elevate Podcast. It's so great to have you on with us one more time. It's your boy Reg.
And Josh.
And we're here with the Alberta Prosperity Project. So today we're speaking with Mitch Sylvester and Jeffrey Rath of the Alberta Prosperity Project, a movement that's been gaining momentum across Alberta, advocating for bold rethinking of the province's relationship with the rest of Canada. And what began as a response to a long-standing grievance around federal politics, economic fairness, and political representation has grown into a larger conversation. We'll explore the core values and the goals of the Alberta Prosperity Project, ask what success looks like, and discuss the tension between reform and independence. So whether you agree with their positions or not, the questions that they're raising speak to a deeper issue in national unity and confederation. And today we'll hear their perspective firsthand. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us today. I just wanted to ask you first off, what does it mean to be Albertan today in your view, and how does that identity differ from the rest of Canada?
For us, it's, basically Albertans are pretty simple people, right? We want to wake up in the morning. We want to work hard, take care of our families, and largely keep government the hell out of our lives. I mean, we're interested in being independent, and we're interested in not being constantly interfered with, through childish, arbitrary government regulation. Mm-hmm. That's, basically it in a nutshell. It's not very complicated. It's basically what it used to mean to be Canadian. But, I guess maybe Albertans now define themselves as not being a bunch of communists.
Mitch, what is your take?
Well, my take is I basically have never been involved with politics up until 3 years ago, till everything got out of control, when they were trying to lock us down and do all manner of things that we had never seen before. So then we got involved with politics, and I happen to live in an area in Alberta that produces 35% of Alberta's oil. So everything that happened from 2014 onwards affected us directly. So as a consequence to, the new national energy policy that's coming from the east, we're seeing a tremendous loss of jobs, a tremendous loss of production, and our economy is suffering as a consequence to it. And the overtaxation that we're seeing from the endless liberal governments, that none of which we support, because we're people that want government to get out of our road, basically, and let us go to work every day and earn our own livings. And as a consequence to that, because we live that way, most of us haven't been paying attention to what's been going on politically in Canada even, or Alberta, because of that fact that we're too busy out there working and earning a living. And now we're seeing that things are absolutely way further down the road than we ever imagined they would be. So that basically spawns this last election, basically spawned the Alberta Prosperity Project and this whole movement. We were onboarding 4,000 or 5,000 Albertans an hour to Alberta Prosperity Project when Carney won this last election.
Right. But I want to dig into a little bit more, though, like about the identity of being Albertan. Because I know that one of the things that the Bloc Québécois put out there is they said, you can't build an identity off of oil. And they're like, we have culture and language, which is fine. But I'm just wondering, what is the Albertan identity that you're trying to put forward?
I'm not sure how poutine equals culture, So, oh boy, we have culture. We have fries with gravy and cheese curds. I mean, give me a break, right? I mean, it's like, Alberta does have a distinct culture. We probably have a lot more in common with our neighbors to the south in Montana than we do people in Quebec who are constantly looking for their next welfare check from Alberta. So I mean, that's, basically that's what, that's the identity, and that's the core of Alberta culture: is self-reliance, hard work, independence, not wanting to be over-regulated, overtaxed, overburdened by constant government interference in our lives. I mean, just look at the recent turfing of Jason Kenney as the Premier of Alberta, right? Mm-hmm. And, I've said this before, and I mean, Mitch would probably agree with me. I mean, there's always been this vague whiff of corruption around the Conservative Party of Alberta, not too bad, but kind of like walking past a septic tank, downwind on the wrong day in the summer. It's kind of that little whiff. It's like, what is that? And that was always what most Albertans thought about the Conservative Party of Alberta, right? And then, but by and large, we tolerated them because they, provided us reasonably good government, kept our taxes reasonably low, and they didn't interfere in our lives. But then along comes Jason Kenney, who's basically a Trudeau liberal and who's interested in national federal office. So that means he feels that he has to pander to everybody in Eastern Canada, who, of course, were terrified of a Chinese cold bug. And because of all these people in Eastern Canada hiding under their desks and hiding under their beds because they're afraid of a Chinese cold virus, Kenny decides he's got to do what Eastern Canada wants him to do, which is to lock us all up in our homes, tell us how many friends we can have, tell us we can't take even though we're healthy and don't have a sniffle, can't take our daughter for breakfast to a local restaurant, can't do all of these things without being forcibly vaccinated against our will with an experimental drug that has proven to be anything but safe and effective. So, when everybody in Alberta kind of woke up and it's like, well, wait a minute, Jason, you broke the fundamental deal in Alberta, which is we tolerate you and your vague, the vague whiff of corruption that constantly surrounds you and your government if you leave us the hell alone. Well, you're not leaving us the hell alone anymore. You're sticking your nose into the most personal aspects of our lives, literally telling us how many friends we're allowed to have at Christmas was one of the stupid orders that Kenny put out. Another really dumb order was they shut down our high schools so our 18-year-old kids could no longer attend grade 12, but they left the casinos, strip clubs, and bars open so our 18-year-old kids were taken out of school so they could go hang out in the casino, strip clubs, or bars. I mean, it was ludicrous what they did to us. And everybody basically woke up en masse in Alberta and said, we're not going to tolerate this from, an allegedly conservative government. And who's the jerk in charge? We're going to throw him out on his ass and replace him because we can. So, I mean, that's what it means to be Albertan. It means being critically thinking, being able to think for yourself, and being able to engage in concerted community action with your neighbors to right a wrong. And everything about Canada now is gone the opposite way. And for me, I mean, quite frankly, I was never seriously considered independence for Alberta, until Trudeau, literally said that healthy human beings that didn't want to get, experimental drugs stuffed into them couldn't get on an airplane anymore. Trudeau, invoking the Emergencies Act to trample little old ladies in the street with riot horses because he couldn't stand the ongoing embarrassment of having people from all over the country in Ottawa, protesting ridiculous government policies that have since been scientifically proven to have been completely wrong. And that's what tore it for me. I mean, I literally woke up one day and turned to a friend and said, wow, it's like if Trudeau won't let me get on a plane and leave Alberta, I guess I'm just gonna have to pick up my province and go. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's, basically I've been working at it ever since.
Right. So it really is kind of born out of that overreach of government from the COVID era into now kind of that lack of representation that we're seeing right now with the non-changing government, I'll say, that continuation of the Liberal government. And so
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely, without question.
And also, to put it into perspective, I mean, I don't want to diminish the historical grievances that have gone on for 40 years. And again, get back to my earlier comment, about, we always tolerated the vague whiff of corruption around the Canadian government, because they generally provided us reasonably good government, tried to keep our taxes as low as possible and stayed the hell out of our lives. And basically that consensus was completely shattered when Trudeau got elected. I mean, I was explaining that to my daughter. I mean, prior to Trudeau, it didn't matter if it was, Harper or Mulroney or Chrétien or Paul Martin or whatever. They all strove to, the basic deal was we're going to try to, lower, get rid of the communist debt and deficit that Trudeau Sr. brought in, get our public finances back to the point where we're not spending 50% of every dollar on interest on the national debt. Basically we had Mulroney, Chrétien, Harper, all working really hard for 30 years to pay down the national debt. I mean, it was down to $400 billion when Trudeau came into power. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even 1 year's GDP. So, I mean, it was, compared to US debt and deficit, it was a baby, it was a puppy. Right? It was easy to deal with. Then along comes Trudeau and uses COVID as an excuse to completely blow all of our, our national budget out of any reasonable proportion. And we're now back at a point where 50% of every tax dollar is going to service the national debt. These are not the values of Albertans. We value hard work. We value thrift. We value, fiscal integrity. And, Canada is literally, to us, has become a communist country that we're trapped in. And we literally see Canada as an existential threat to Albertans in the province of Alberta. I mean, from our perspective, Ottawa is largely run and manipulated by the communist Chinese. And we're sick of it.
So I wanted to jump in there for a second there, because we're talking a lot about, Alberta and kind of in the frame of almost like separatism and separation. And some have labeled that as your group. Do you embrace that term, or do you prefer another term, or do you see yourselves differently?
No, well, we don't see ourselves as separatists, and I think we always maintain that that Canada's separated from us. I mean, we don't live in Canada anymore. The values that we were brought up with as Canadians went out the window, when Trudeau started trampling protesters in the streets with riot horses. And then having, judges in the country that were appointed by this Liberal government basically saying that the charter didn't apply. And as long as, representatives of the Trudeau government came into court and said, we're really scared, it's an emergency, all these rights have to stop because we can't have rights in the middle of an emergency. When all that foolishness happened, they basically broke the societal contract, with everybody in Alberta. And we're going like, that's not our country. We don't have privileges, we have rights. We want our rights to be respected. We don't want to live in a world where, whatever it is that, that the government says on paper our rights are really just privileges that can be taken away anytime a government says it's reasonable to do so. Those aren't rights.
Mm-hmm.
And to add to that, let's just finish that conversation. And to add to that, 82 ethics violations. The government is obviously above the law. They're not held to account to anything. They're not accounting for hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. That's also breaking a contract with us. We are supposed to have responsible government to take care of our money. They're actually misplacing funds all over the place, with ArriveCan, with Trudeau printing $350 or so billion without audit. Mr. Carney just gives himself $100 billion slush fund right off the bat. All this kind of stuff is absolutely against democracy and against everything we stand for. We believe that the Liberal government believes that they're above the law, and if they're above the law, then we no longer live in a democracy. So our problem is goes right to that level. So if we cannot hold our government accountable, what good is it for us to build more pipelines? Of course, that would be great for a while, but then they're still controlling the money. We have no people up there. There's no accountability at all. So things have to change. And that's pretty much basically where we are. And we can't change what goes on nationally, so we have to change what goes on here in our own backyard.
And then, and following up on that, and again, I don't want to focus too much on grievance because I do want to get into what the benefits are going to be to Albertans the minute Alberta declares itself independent from Canada. But, the other thing is just look at the structural imbalances within Confederation that are completely built into the architecture of the country, right? So the Maritimes in total have 30 Senate seats. So that's 6 for Newfoundland, 4 for PEI, and then 10 each for Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Okay. Combined, the Maritimes, Newfoundland, PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick don't even have half of Alberta's population, yet they have 30 Senate seats to our 6, right? The Supreme Court of Canada, 3 seats for Ontario, 3 seats for Quebec, 1 seat for the Maritimes, and 2 seats for the entire western half of the country. So anytime a division of powers case goes up to the Supreme Court that threatens the status quo or threatens the ability of the federal government to continue sucking money like a giant money vacuum out of Alberta to give money to Quebec and the other so-called have-not provinces at the expense of the Alberta taxpayer, how do you think the Supreme Court rules every time? They go against Alberta because Quebec and Ontario control the majority of that court, and it's a structural problem. So, those are real issues, that we can only fix because the Canadian Constitution is virtually unamendable. Many scholars have written about that. The only way to fix it is to get Alberta the hell out of Canada. We'll have our own Supreme Court. We'll have our own, we'll have a new system of government that won't be, the 5-year elected dictatorships that you see under the Westminster system of parliamentary, so-called parliamentary democracy, which really is just, parliamentary oligarchy when it comes right down to it. And you look at the influence that all of the multi-billionaires have in terms of making policy in Canada. Why was Trudeau on a big rant over heat pumps, and why did he want everybody to have heat pumps? Well, it's because Brookfield owned the largest company that manufactured heat pumps. Why did Trudeau change the tanker specifications for oil tankers to ship oil from Alberta to Texas? Well, he changed the specifications because the only company that now has tankers that meet the specifications is Berkshire Hathaway, which of course has strong financial ties to Brookfield, and on and on and on. The billionaires, run the show at the expense of the citizens. And one of the big pushes for Alberta independence is to actually create a new constitution in Alberta that sees, the politicians and the bureaucrats responsive to the citizens of Alberta rather than the billionaires of Alberta, and the elite cliques that run our governments. So, so it's as much a democratic reform movement as it is an independence movement, because we're all sick and tired of the way we're being governed.
Absolutely. And so, genuinely curious, because you touched on that a little bit, say referendum comes, the vote goes through, Alberta wants to secede from Canada. What does that model actually look like? Are you your own nation? Are you a nation within a nation? Or do you go and join the states? Like, what does that model look like in terms of sustaining an independent Alberta?
The model that APP is promoting, and we've done polling on it, and we're responsive to our membership. We're a grassroots organization. The vast majority of our members want to be independent from Canada and the United States. They don't want to join the United States, but they definitely want the hell out of Canada. And and when we say not joining the United States, there's different ways that you can affiliate with the U.S. either as a territory like Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, right? The other one is like Micronesia is a freely associated state. Those things have their advantages, but our sense in Alberta and from discussions we've had with the U.S. administration, that the U.S. would support a fully independent Alberta in a common market with the United States, no tariffs on either side of the U.S. Alberta border, and full integration of our economies, and which would provide the U.S. the security of energy supply that they're looking for, because they can't take the risk that every year or two, some communist Chinese adjacent politician in Ottawa, be it Trudeau or Mark Carney, just arbitrarily decides to shut down Alberta production or put a production cap on, or another ridiculous emissions cap, or whatever it is. So, from a security supply and national security perspective, an independent Alberta is strongly in the U.S. national interest. So, what we would see is a successful referendum in Alberta. We would see almost an immediate recognition by the United States of Alberta as an independent nation state. And it would be our hope that we wouldn't be negotiating within the framework of the Clarity Act, that we would be negotiating with Canada on a nation-to-nation basis with regard to, our relationship, and any disputes that arise, in that context wouldn't be resolved by the Supreme Court of Canada that has 6 seats in favor of Quebec and Ontario, but would be resolved by an arbitrator appointed by the International Court of Commercial Arbitration in The Hague, or some such international mechanism, where, the arbitration will be purely independent and divorced from the framework of Canadian jurisprudence, which obviously favors Quebec and Ontario continuing to suck 20, 30, 40 billion dollars a year out of Alberta, for their benefit and the detriment of Albertans.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned there was you mentioned having these conversations with the states. Have there been any other prominent individuals or industry leaders that have stepped forward to support the Alberta Prosperity Project? And if so, why do you think that they're aligning with you now?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we have CEOs, bank CEOs. We have oil and gas industry leaders. We've got, very prominent business people in Alberta that are supporting what we're doing, because they all see what we see, which is that Mark Carney and the Liberal government of Canada is an existential threat to Alberta. Let's be clear. There's a number of Alberta billionaires that are very invested in the status quo. I mean, let's face it, people that profit really well in a high tax, high regulatory environment are the ones that are likely the most benefiting from whatever tax breaks they're getting, tax credits they're getting, payments of so-called carbon credits back to them, subsidies paid to them, all that kind of stuff. So basically, all the billionaires that have figured out how to become billionaires by just burying their face in the trough, aren't really keen on what we're doing in terms of wanting to upset the status quo. But any business people that understand basic economics and understand the basic fact that legitimate, honest businesses, that have real economics behind them, thrive the best in a low tax, low regulatory environment, which is effectively what we want to turn Alberta back into.
Right. And so have you had any conversations with the Premier's office, with Daniel Smith and with those folks?
I'll let Mitch speak to that one.
Well, yeah. Well, I have had conversation with the Premier's office. As a matter of fact, I had a direct conversation with the Premier on stage at an event that I put on, and we discussed this pretty much at length. What happened is that we discussed the relationship between Alberta and Canada and the nature of the abuse, and the Premier identified that, and the Premier's also given Ottawa 8 or 9 list of demands that she expects them to give to Alberta. She's drawn a line in the sand. And apparently in public, she told us that she's giving them 6 months to respond. However, since then, she's publicly said that she's in favor of an independent Alberta within Canada. That would be her model choice. However, not ours. We're at the point now where we don't understand how that could possibly work unless you change all of the things that Jeff brought up, which I don't believe they're ever going to do. So, Alberta has to be treated equally like, we have to have exactly the same as Quebec at the bare minimum for that to work. And I really don't believe that with the corruption that we're seeing at the top of the Liberal government, that Albertans want anything to do with Ottawa anymore. And once they hear what's actually happening and are made aware of it, they double down, and not only do they get absolutely angry with it. So the whole problem with that is that, yeah, we're talking to the UCP all the time. The UCP, we elected the UCP. The UCP is representing Albertans, and a majority of the UCP support Alberta independence.
Mm-hmm. And
that's something that people really need to internalize. That right now, recent polling done in Alberta and reported in various papers has support for Alberta independence at over 65% within the UCP membership, and a poll that came out recently has support for independence at over 70% of everybody that voted Conservative in the last federal election. So, and again, from an Alberta perspective, what is there anyway that Carney can offer Danielle Smith that has more value than all of the following, right? A complete end to all federal regulation in Alberta, which includes carbon regulation. A complete end to all federal taxes in Alberta, which includes no longer having to pay any federal income tax, no longer having to pay federal GST, capital gains tax, corporate tax, excise taxes on fuel, carbon tax. Let's go down the list, right? So, the math is, and we have a costed business plan. You might want to have us back on in a week or so. We'll be releasing very soon. We're going to be releasing a costed business plan that's literally in final editing and sort of pre-production, that shows that Alberta literally sends $70 billion a year to Ottawa. We get less than $20 billion a year back. And even after budgeting for an independent Alberta Armed Forces, budgeting to triple the spend on Indigenous people in Alberta to finally lift them out of poverty, the poverty that Canada's left them in for the last 150 years, budgeting for all the so-called federal services we get, like NAVCAN, airports, whatever. What are some of the other, there were a number of them, but budgeting for all of the federal services, immigration, et cetera, budgeting for all of that, we were left with a $30 to $50 billion fiscal capacity surplus that would immediately allow in year one, the Alberta tax burden to be cut by between 31 and 55% in year one. And then we've done economic projections, taking this out 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And we literally see that within 5 to 10 years, that Alberta, through its ability to double its oil and gas production, freed from all of the federal constraints, 5 years from now could be like Dubai, or could be like Monaco or other jurisdictions where we have zero income tax for any citizen of Alberta, and the whole, government being funded through resource royalties and, corporate, flat corporate tax rate of 10% from all of the economic activity generated in the province of Alberta. Like, we literally think that, freed from Ottawa's regulations and overtaxation, that businesses, unlike Quebec, when it went to have its independence referendum, where they, the question wasn't even the least bit clear, where they thought they could leave Canada and still have members of parliament and, all of that goofy stuff that got them 49.1% or whatever it was. But unlike Quebec, businesses aren't going to be fleeing Alberta. They're going to be fleeing to Alberta. If you're told you can set up a business, have your tax burden cut in more than half, and not be subject to any ridiculous federal regulations, and just be subject to sensible regulations against, from an environmental perspective, preventing pollution, ensuring that, that the environment, proper environmental cleanup following projects, all those types of things. What business wouldn't want to locate here? We'd be seeing businesses flood in from all over North America. So we literally see that Alberta's GDP within 5 years could more than double. Right. I mean, why is it that Alberta's current GDP is 355 billion, right? And Ireland's, which is smaller than us, doesn't have the wealth that we have, doesn't have the same level of education to their population that we do. Ireland's GDP is over 500 billion. Yeah. And they have the second highest GDP per capita of any country in the world. So we don't see any reason for, immediately after independence that Alberta couldn't move to the number one spot for GDP per capita and, become one of the wealthiest nations on a per capita basis in the world.
Right. And
so, I mean, to me, it's a complete no-brainer. When you see I'll send you the email as soon as we publish that plan so you got it. But when you see the financial business plan that we put together, the numbers are staggering in terms of how well off and how wealthy Alberta's going to be without having to carry the weight of Canada and all the parasites in Quebec that, suck $50 billion a year, out of Alberta. So I guess when Quebec talks about, not having a culture, maybe the culture of Quebec is that they're all just a bunch of leeches and just love other people's money. And as long as they can suck money out of other people's pockets, that's their culture. I don't know what else to say to that, but it seems to be the case.
So one thing I wanted to go back to, you mentioned about the stats of people who voted UPC, and you mentioned the stats of people who voted Conservative. So have you had conversations with the Conservative Party, the federal Conservatives? Because, looking at Alberta, that's a stronghold for them. We saw that when Pierre lost his seat, that they actually, kicked somebody out of their riding in Alberta to guarantee him a seat, basically. So what have the conversations been like with that party? Because if Alberta leaves, that's their entire base. That's basically the end of the Conservative Party in Canada right there.
Well, that's exactly right.
We haven't talked to them.
You haven't talked to them,
Jeff?
And I think the reality is they don't want to talk to us right now. Yeah, because let's face it, they're actually, as far as we're concerned, as far as APP is concerned, the Conservative Party of Canada is part of the problem. Pierre Poilievre, right now, it's like, I don't know if you remember that cartoon, but the little small dog jumping around after the bulldog going, "Hey, Spike, that's a good idea, Spike." I mean, that's literally what Pierre Poilievre is doing with Carney right now. "Oh, that's a good idea. Let's join the European Union, Spike. Oh, let's shift all of our defense spending to Europe," on and on and on. Whatever Carney comes out with now, I mean, Poilievre's a big proponent of the Me Too movement. He's just going, "Me too, me too." What idiot thinks it's a good idea to continually stick our thumb in the eye of our largest trading partner, being the United States, who has graciously, provided us an umbrella of military protection for the last 40 years without much complaint. And then we reward that by saying, okay, well, instead of addressing our trade deficit with the United States, which both Canada and U.S. trade officials, not Trump, he uses a $200 billion number, but our trade officials seem to have agreed to a $57 billion trade deficit between Canada and the United States. How hard would it have been for Carney or even Trudeau for that matter, to say when Trump was wanting to throw the tariffs on, say, "Hey, you know what? You're right. We've been underfunding our NATO commitment by 100%. We're supposed to be at 2%. We're closer to 1%. We have issues along the border. We have this trade deficit issue that we know is a major irritant for you, President Trump. Here, let's solve the problem for you. We're immediately going to place a $57 billion order with Lockheed, General Dynamics, Raytheon, whatever. We're going to buy a whole bunch of surveillance drones. We're going to buy a bunch of attack drones. We're going to buy a whole bunch of helicopters, armored personnel, all kinds of equipment to help patrol the border, on and on and on. And we want to show you that we're good neighbors and we want to meet our NATO commitment." It would have been so easy to do. Mm-hmm. But instead, we now have this goofy $150 billion plan that ties us in even more closely to Europe. You got Mark Carney running around making noises like he wants Canada to join the EU. I mean, stupidest idea ever. right? I mean, or let me put it this way: like, I want to be governed by a bureaucrat from Brussels. Said no Albertan ever. Right? Like, if you want to see Alberta independence really succeed, float that suggestion in Alberta and tell every Albertan what it's going to mean and what the cost to our economy is going to be to comply with every single regulation of the European Union in order to be part of the EU. I mean, we're literally being governed by idiots right now. Mm-hmm. And that's a big driver in terms of getting people, wanting Albertans to get the hell out of Canada.
I kind of leads into that a little bit more, because right now, as you're going across the province, you're having conversations, you're trying to let people know what you're doing. Is there any pocket or any groups of people in the province you're finding right now that are going to be the hardest to convince? And what is it do you think it'll take to convince them?
I think all they have to do is show up and listen. We just have to get the message out, and we're going to get the message out. We're accumulating funds, and we're basically going to tell Albertans the truth and what's going on, and let them decide, because this is ultimately a democracy. But the whole thing is this: people that are coming to our events understand what's happening and are actually excited about it.
And to be clear, if we like some of the people, obviously, you have a lot of pensioners, like what's going to happen to our CPP. So you got a lot of the liberal toadies and NDP adjacent toadies, spewing disinformation just like they did during COVID. And they're, oh, you're going to lose your pension. Oh, you're going to lose your passport. Well, first of all, pensions are a legal obligation. You can live in Costa Rica, you can retire in Costa Rica, and you're still entitled to your CPP. So there's no reason that you wouldn't be entitled to CPP just because you lived in an independent Alberta. The other thing is Canada doesn't recognize the renunciation of citizenship, and an independent Alberta is not going to make any citizens of Alberta renounce their Canadian citizenship. I mean, the first three lines of the U.S. citizenship oath is, I hereby renounce all, citizenships, foreign or domestic. I'm not beholden to any foreign prince or potentate or sovereign power, blah, 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 and renounce, all citizenships or rights pertaining thereto. I mean, that's basically how the U.S. Constitution will start. So let's think about Mr. Mike Myers, elbows up Canada dude, right? So he's got, that little toad has a UK citizenship, a Canadian citizenship, and then he went down to the US and falsely swore an oath to the US saying that he was going to renounce his Canadian citizenship and his UK citizenship to become an American citizen. Well, obviously he didn't renounce his Canadian citizenship. He didn't renounce his UK citizenship, but he wants to come up here and lie to us and tell us he's still a Canadian when he swore an oath saying that he's not. And it's the same thing with Carney. I mean, he said he was going to get rid of his other passports. He's got 3 or 4 of them, right? We don't know that he did, or that any of those countries recognized his renunciation of their citizenship. So Carney's probably not doesn't have dual citizenship. He probably has 3 or 4. Canada, EU, UK, Ireland, whatever. We have no proof he's renounced his citizenship. And then on top of it, Carney wants to basically tax us all to death. We don't even know where that bastard keeps his money. I'd like some honest journalist to ask him. It's like, so Mr. Carney, can you please tell us where the bulk of your assets are kept, blind trust or not, and in what jurisdictions you pay taxes? Because I can guarantee you it's not Alberta and it's not Canada. Even though he wants to come here and say because he went to high school in Edmonton, he's an Albertan. When he's basically an EU bureaucrat that wants to turn the whole country, into a piggy bank for Europe.
I want to jump back to one of the things that you said earlier about Danielle Smith when we were talking about that. Danielle Smith has said that she wants to see independent Alberta within a unified Canada. And so let's just say that, the referendum doesn't pass, and Danielle Smith does get, some of these bills repealed. Is that enough for the Alberta Prosperity Project, or what do you think is going to be the next step? Is it going to be something like a Bloc Québécois for Alberta, or
no? Because we're just going to keep working to get Alberta out of Canada. We're not going to be the Bloc Québécois. We don't want seats in Parliament in Ottawa. We see Ottawa as a foreign parliament, and we want nothing to do with it. On the Danielle Smith front, I mean, the big issue for her is how long is she going to continue to be embarrassed by her involvement with Team Canada? We're going to get pipelines, we're going to get a deal. And then Gibault pipes up and it's like, no, you're not. Like, we don't need any more pipelines. Oh, we're going to get lots of pipelines. Carney says, oh, well, maybe one pipeline, provided every province agrees. And then when a reporter asks them, hey, does that mean that you're going to allow provincial premiers to assert a veto over Alberta pipelines? Oh, yeah, well, no, we can't not listen to the provinces. There has to be a national consensus. So it's like every time Danielle turns around, she's being played for a fool by Carney. And I've said more than once, it's like, isn't that nice that you're on a team where every time you turn around, one of your teammates elbows you in the teeth and knocks one of your teeth out? Because that's basically what's happening to Danielle Smith right now. And the big problem for her is, Albertans are paying attention. 6 months from now, when she has nothing to show for her 6-month courtship with Mark Carney, other than constant promises and political mouthings about being on Team Canada and a strong Alberta within a strong Canada and all the slogans she's throwing out, she's going to look really foolish. She's going to be really embarrassed. And then, she's going to have to, either leave politics or join the sovereignty movement.
So what do you think?
She'll look like a complete fool when 6 months from now she gets absolutely nothing from, Carney and the Liberals that, again, there's nothing that they can offer that's going to be more valuable than ending all federal regulation of Alberta and all taxation of Alberta.
Right. So what do you think that she should be doing right now then?
She should be calling Alberta pension back. That's something that she can do. She should start her own police force, just like Quebec and Ontario have. We pay $1.5 billion more in EI every year. We could take control of that. We could collect our own provincial taxes. That would be a really good start. And once she got all that done here, then then should the next step be something that we would entertain in the future, then it would be easy to do it.
Right.
6 years ago, apparently, and I didn't realize this until the other day. A political philosophy professor that taught me when I was at the U of A, a guy by the name of Professor Leon Craig, he wrote an open letter to Jason Kenney 6 years ago, saying that Alberta needs to immediately appoint a minister of independence preparedness, right? That's what she should be doing right now, as opposed to burying her head in the sand, with Carney standing behind her. I mean, it's not a very good look for her.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing they should do is the fifth thing is control immigration. We need to control immigration into Alberta as well. And that should be a provincial government responsibility.
One of the big frustrations for citizens of Alberta, and certainly young Albertans that are looking forward to an independent Alberta, is the fact that none of them can afford apartments right now. A one-bedroom apartment in Calgary and Edmonton is like $800. So, kids that are starting out looking, first of all, they can't find jobs at an entry level or even for minimum wage because the hundreds of thousands of people that Trudeau brought in on open work permits, are taking all the entry level jobs. And then on top of it, the reason that the apartment rents are so high is because so many of the so-called refugees, work permit people, whatever they are that Trudeau's flooding Alberta with, are literally being paid federal subsidies to rent apartments. So, somebody that's actually trying to work for a living can't compete with somebody who's literally being given money by the federal government. And then think about that again when you think about what Brookfield's primary business is, which is buying and owning and renting building space. How much of that federal money that's going to these immigrants that they're flooding our country with, literally is moving, directly through their hands into the hands of Brookfield-controlled landlords and buildings, maintaining these high rates. So it's basically just another huge government subsidy of Brookfield and Carney's interests through government policy to the detriment of everyday citizens. It's awful.
And well, obviously your work is cut out for you at this point. There's a lot going on. We wish you well on your journey, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us and educate our listeners who are typically on the eastern side, a lot on the western as well. But just kind of what you're up to, what you're thinking, and where the progress you've made at this point is really helpful for our listeners.
And for all of your listeners in Quebec, I think you should reach out to your provincial government and say, look, we're proud Quebecers. We have culture. We want to stand on our own feet. We don't want Alberta money anymore. We don't want their dirty oil and we don't want their dirty money. Like, wouldn't it be lovely to see a movement like that in Quebec? But I'm not holding my breath.
Well, thanks guys so much for being with us, and we'll let you go, and we'll put that out to the listeners. So thank you so much.
Yeah, have a nice day. All right.
You
Goodbye.
too.